to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today, composting, letting things sit around and rot. Yes, it's going to be a fun topic today, and this is a thing that people might not want to do, maybe think it's a lot of work, but we're going to show you it can be super simple and easy if you want it to be, or as complicated as you would prefer it to be. So you know I'm not doing this by myself. I am joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. I think that perfectly describes just about anything in gardening. You can make it as simple or as complicated as you want.
That's true. Yeah, that's pretty true. And folks, if you want to keep it simple, maybe just stop listening to podcasts about gardening, stop reading books about gardening. Just don't learn anything, because the more you learn, the more complicated it seems to get. I don't know what to do anymore.
The more ideas you have.
I know. I'm running out of I'm running out of budget. I'm running out of space. I'm running out of so much stuff. So stop learning right here, right now. We're not a very good educational podcast. But Ken, I guess I'm curious, do you compost at home?
Yeah, I guess you could call it that. We take the very simplistic approach to it, and we just have a pile in the backyard. And I'm sure hardcore composters would cringe at what I've got going on in the backyard, but we we'll call that compost. And we've done vermicomposting. I probably won't talk about that much today, but we've done that in the past, usually just in the winter. Keep saying I need to get more worms, but I never actually get to the point of getting more worms. So we haven't done it for a few years.
Yeah.
How about you?
About the same. So I would assume, yes, the hardcore composters, they're definitely going to have some issues here with today. My compost pile is just that. It's an open pile. I do vermicompost. I've been doing that since 2012. I have taken a year off of that though. And so, oh my gosh, 2024. Yeah, it's been a long time. I've been a long time vermicomposter. So yeah, do a little bit of everything. Ken, I suppose our first thing we need to define is compost. What is it? What is this black gold, as we call it?
Yes. Well, I'll read the USDA definition here. So composting is the controlled aerobic decomposition of organic matter by microorganisms into a stable humus-like soil amendment. The final material should have the following characteristics: unrecognizable original materials, dark brown, no foreign matter, so on and so forth. So taking organic material, breaking it down into humus, like the soil stuff, not hummus that you eat. That's what, I don't know, what is hummus? Is that sesame? Chickpeas, sesame, olive oil, some other stuff.
Yeah,
so,
garlic.
yes. Yeah. You don't want to eat this stuff.
No, just humus-like and not hummus-like. Yeah. I think, and did they also say into like a soil component? Is that what it had described it as? I thought I heard the S word in there, the soil word.
Yes, soil amendment.
Soil amendment. So this is, I think, an important distinction. It is something that my soils professor drove into our head, is that compost or organic matter, in this case, is not soil. A lot of folks will say this compost is soil, and the professor would say, no, it is not. It is a component, or it is a part of it, whereas it is really just a small, teeny tiny little fraction of it. So in this soil that we imagine in our head, like that ideal soil, half of it is pore space and the other half is like physical material. Most of that physical material are minerals: sand, silt, and clay. And an ideal soil, we would only be looking at about a 5% organic matter. And that organic matter, that would be the compost. Like that's that thing that we could be adding into that soil. And so I think that's an important distinction that I had been tested over many times about this particular, what is compost, what is organic matter, and especially, when you would be going out to fill a hole in the yard and someone would throw compost in the hole and said, "Oh, I filled it." Well, only temporarily, because compost is not permanent. It goes away. So when we're filling holes in the yard or we're leveling things, we want to use mineral components of the soil. But the organic matter is very important and critical for what makes soil. Because soil is alive. The other thing that has driven into my head multiple times, the living, breathing soil, and that fed with organic matter.
Yeah, so it's going to be an important component because a lot of our soils, normally we're like 5%.
Mm-hmm.
Some of you get down further south in the U.S. that organic matter starts dropping quite a bit and stuff. So it's one of the reasons why we have good soils here is that that higher organic matter to it, and the sand, silt, clay ratios and stuff helps too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the previous land uses and all that. Yeah, the history we could get into soils. That would be another good podcast topic. Coming up next week, the history of soils in Illinois. No, I'm kidding. We don't know. Can't talk about that yet. I need to read a book or something first.
Maybe a few.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I guess we should probably go into, so now that we've kind of defined, I guess, the process of what compost is, how do we go about making said black gold?
Yes. I think at the very beginning I had referenced this. It can be a little intimidating, especially if you sat through like a composting class, and we'll get into this stuff, but you've heard the terms like, oh, your carbon to nitrogen ratio, making sure that you're layering things together and you're adding enough water and air and all that. Maybe you're like, well, that's not for me, and that's fine. Composting can be a lot of work. It can be really simple. So on that simple side of the equation is passive composting, where you're literally just piling things up in a part of your yard and you just let it sit there. And it will compost just like if you are doing the other end of the spectrum where you're doing active composting, where you are maybe measuring out the different ingredients that you're adding to the pile. You're turning it, you're making sure that it is well watered, that it is aerated. You're using a thermometer probe to measure the temperature. Once you're, that's a lot of work, can be a lot of fun. I'd say they can both be a lot of fun because at the end you get compost. But the active composting, you could go from raw material to a finished compost within, maybe 3-4 weeks, a month during the warm part of the year. Whereas with the passive composting, it might take you a year or longer for that pile to really break down. And it really breaks down in the center. And then, you might dig out the center to use that compost and just sort of keep piling things on like I do. No turning here, just harvest where I can get the pitchfork into the middle. So that's really a range of effort for you, passive versus active composting.
Yeah, I think, the passive, I think maybe the composting purists wouldn't consider that composting because you're just kind of letting it rot. Whereas I think, you're more hardcore. I don't know if that's the right term, but I think in their mind, your composting is that actual active, whereas just sitting there isn't, true composting, but for our definitions, it is.
I believe everyone can be a composter, Ken. Oh, yes. So we'll get to some of the ways that you can build these piles. But remember, like the way I do it is I literally will cut things and I just drop them on the ground. And then when I get maybe piles of things and it's too much, I'll just take it over to the compost pile. So, whether it's sitting there where I just cut it next to the plant, It will rot naturally right there, or compost naturally right there. Sorry, I didn't mean to use the R word. Or I can take it over to an actual pile where I do have a lot of landscape debris over there, throw it on top there. I mean, that's what I do. I'm not measuring anything. I'm just throwing stuff here and there.
Yep, that's pretty much what we do. We just dump. Half the time we don't even cut. It just gets dumped. And I think we've had that pile for, how long has it been there now? 6-7 years. I don't think I've ever taken anything out of it. I probably should open it up and see what it's like on the inside, but
it gets smaller though, right? Like it shrinks, and then you add more to it, then it could, so.
Yep, over time you can tell if we haven't added anything in a while, it'll slowly shrink down.
I guess, Ken, then, like, my pile is sort of tucked away in a shaded part of the yard. Where is yours located? Does that matter what type of sunlight it's getting?
Yeah, ours is in the shade too. As far as sun versus shade, it probably doesn't really matter a whole lot. It's going to compost whether it's in the sun or the shade. I will say that the sun, during the summer, it may dry out a little bit quicker, and moisture is going to be important. And if you let it dry out, the composting process is going to start or stop. So maybe having afternoon shade would be beneficial. But if you've got it in full sun, it'll still compost. You just kind of probably have to keep a closer eye on those moisture levels. So that's a really where if you've got a spot, it doesn't really matter, sun, shade, you can still do it.
Yeah. I guess I mentioned measuring the temperature. That doesn't really have as much to do with sun. That's more microbial activity that's creating that heat. So just clarification there. That's what I meant by that heat.
Yeah. Yeah, those microbes are breaking things down. Heat's going to be given off, and your pile will heat up, and that'll help the process of breaking things down. It just kind of feeds itself.
Yeah. One of the things, like if you are an active composter, though, you would want to have it near a water source, and that because I think because you do need to irrigate your compost pile. Because for those microbes to activate, they need two things in kind of a balanced formula. They need water and air. And without one of those things, usually too dry, as you mentioned, Ken, composting, that decomposition stops. Too much water and our aerobic composting stops. And we start getting anaerobic composting or rotting, which is decomposition without oxygen, which creates lots of smelly gases like sulfur and things like that. And so water in your pile is important, getting down, especially in the interior. So that might mean when you're building your pile or when you're turning it, you might need to water it as you begin building it up or start turning it layer by layer. That way, that interior of the pile has gotten moisture into it. I know I've seen folks, they will water the top of it, but if you dig down just maybe a foot down, that water does not penetrate all the way down to the center of the pile. And so it's something important to know. And I guess I do know some people even cover their compost pile to hold some of that moisture in, so they don't have to water as often.
Or to prevent excess moisture if you're getting a lot of, if we're getting, not that, you probably put this on all the time, not just when it's getting rainy, but if you're getting a lot of rain and stuff, that can help keep that water out of there so it's not getting too wet and getting anaerobic and nice and smelly on you.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think the ideal size, your critical mass, for a compost pile is something like a cubic yard. Like that's the smallest it needs to be, or it can be. You smaller than that, it's going to be really hard for it to fire up some of that decomposition. It will still work, just not as fast. But yeah, that 3 by 3 by 3 ish cubic yard, that's something you would be shooting for when you're building your pile.
Yeah, usually 3 by 3 by 3 up to like 5 by 5 by 5 is usually kind of the recommendations you see somewhere Somewhere in that range, yes. Not too big, not too small. It's that Goldilocks zone, if you will.
Yes. We'll be talking more about that Goldilocks, everything in moderation later.
So then when it comes to, I guess, actually, so we know we need moisture, we know we need air, we know the size, but what are we actually putting in there? So we've got our brown materials and our green materials. And that's when we start getting into that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So typically we're looking at somewhere between 20 to 30 to 1. You're kind of depending on where you were, 25 to 1, probably be an easy way to remember that. So you've got 25 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And that's kind of the ideal ratio for this to be broken down into that kind of that high quality compost. If you get too much carbon in there, it's not going to break down as well. Too much nitrogen, you might start getting a little smelly on you. Usually that's high moisture stuff that your nitrogen sources. So your nitrogen sources are going to be things like vegetable scraps, kitchen waste, and that's what usually 15 to 1 ratio, 12 to 1 ratio, something like that. So it's a lower carbon, so that's going to be considered a green. Grass clippings would be another one. You could do weeds. Just make sure you're taking off seed heads, because our compost systems in backyards probably are not going to get hot enough to kill weed seeds. And even if you are getting it that hot, it's probably not going to kill all of them. So those would be some examples of some greens you could use. If you have access to manures, like livestock, cow, pig, chicken, what have you, you could do that. You want to avoid cat, dog, human waste, because we're predators, and there's pathogens in there that we could pass on through that. So we're sticking towards, I guess, your vegetarian animals, your livestock, chicken. I guess chickens eat, but you can put chicken in there, or chicken compost. Probably don't want to put real chicken, or dead chickens in there, at least in the backyard. And avoiding meat, bones, because you'll get critters coming in, raccoons and stuff, digging it up. A lot of fatty foods, oily foods, that can clog up that pore space, and then again attract wildlife and stuff. And as far as the browns, that's going to be leaves in the fall, straw, could be like wood mulch. That's going to be pretty high carbon nitrogen ratio, 3, 4, 500 to 1. So you're going to need a little bit of that's going to go a long way. Same thing with something like sawdust. That's a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio. More than likely, in most landscapes, I would say browns are not going to be an issue finding those, at least for us. A lot of times you have plenty of browns, but sometimes the greens aren't kind of at the level that you would need, if you're going to be doing this all at once. So some people like freeze those greens and hold on to them until they get enough that they can start layering it when we get to talking about building the pile. So there's multiple different things we can use to build our piles.
Well, and I guess speaking of building a pile, it sounds like both you and I don't do this, but if we were going to start an active compost pile, we would want to measure things out at least. And I think for the most part, we're doing this by volume. We're sort of just eyeballing all of this. If you wanted to get a big scale and weigh everything out, definitely could do that. But for the most part, it is, we've got a couple buckets of this, a couple buckets of that, and so we're sort of doing this just by bucket load, wheelbarrow full. And so taking your greens, I think a lot of composting instruction starts with layering things. And so that's that's a great way to start, because it can help you visually see, again, sort of that 20 to 30 to 1. So you would be taking like 1 part of your green, and then you would put that down on a layer, and then you would add 2 to 3 parts of your brown material, your carbon material. And I guess also, yeah, I think you described several materials, Ken, that just because we call them like green materials and brown materials, color is not necessarily an indication of how much nitrogen they have. Like coffee grounds, they have a lower C/N ratio, or I think it's like It's like 20 to 1, 25 to 1, I think, as opposed to, something else like straw or wood chips, which is much higher. So, yeah. And manures, as you said, those aren't usually green. They're usually darker color. And so, just I think be aware, too, that color doesn't indicate necessarily how much nitrogen something has. But there are tables and lists online that can list the different ingredients in your compost pile and what their carbon to nitrogen ratio would be, so that you don't get one just completely out of whack, where you're just like sitting there for years, like, why isn't anything happening? Or it's just, maybe you just added way too much nitrogen material, and it's just sort of really firing up. Sometimes they can steam, they can get pretty hot. They can smell with that excess green material. Again, usually it's a lot too much moisture. So Ken had said, if we're mounding this up, so 1 part green, 2 to 3 parts brown. What happens when we have too much carbon? Which is so often the case in our neck of the woods with trees and leaves. And if you get a tree gets cut down, you have wood chips. What do you do with that excess carbon? Well, you can actually sprinkle on a little bit of extra nitrogen fertilizer in your compost pile to balance or even that out, just a little bit. So, yeah, if you've put a lot more carbon materials, try fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer.
Yeah, and a lot of times when people are building these piles, doing the layering, so kind of your lasagna, browns on the bottom, then your greens, and a lot of times they'll take a scoop of soil or something, or finished compost, put that on there, and that's going to introduce, I guess, more. There's going to be microbes there anyway, but that's going to introduce more microbes. So it may not take quite as long for that stuff to really get going. And just a lot of times with your active, at least from people I've listened to and talked to, a lot of times you're building that kind of all at once, and then you're actively managing that, and then you're going to start building another pile. You're not necessarily continually adding on to that active pile, just because, as things are breaking down, you're adding new stuff in. It can get a little complicated. You can certainly do it. A lot of times people are doing like a 3-bin system where they've got one that's actively composting, they're building one, and they've got one like finishing. So it's done composting, it's cooled off, and they're letting it sit for a little bit, pull that out, and then build your new one there. The one you're building is going to become your active, and the one you have been working on is becoming your kind of sitting and aging type of thing. So, again, a variety of different ways that you can go about doing this. And there's all kinds of different plans online for as how to do it. There's bins, there's different things you can, gadgets, the tumblers and stuff, so that you're not having to go in with a pitchfork or some kind of fork and turn them. You can just, crank a wheel there to get that done. There's rollers that you just roll around in your yard that I've seen. Probably should have gotten one of those when the kids were younger. That would have been that would have been good. But I think there's the University of Wisconsin has a bunch of plans, like multiple different compost bin setups on their website. So we can throw a link to that in the show notes.
We actually did have one of those rolly compost bins that you could roll around on the ground, and looked like the Death Star. We should have painted it to look like the Death Star. The novelty of rolling it around with the kids wore off almost immediately. They do get heavy. There's lots of different methods. And I think because there's so many different styles, if you have maybe space constraints, there are smaller compost bin tumblers, smaller things you can use in a smaller yard, maybe even on like a patio or a porch, something like that. And if you're worried things like rodents, vermin, Ken and I, we've talked, we have open compost piles. You can do a closed pile, like the tumbler, like a closed bin, like the rolly thing that my kids didn't like to roll around the yard. So there are ways to create a physical barrier from your compost that's occurring and anything else that you might not want scratching around in your pile, like rodents or your family pets.
Yeah, and speaking of rodents, it may be a good thing if to check on any ordinances that may be. I think up in Chicago, I think there are some rules about bins and stuff, openings, how big they can be to prevent rats and stuff. If you're a more rural area, probably not going to be any restrictions. But if you live in a city, you may want to check to see if there's any kind of restrictions or any rules you have to follow when you're composting.
Very good point. Yeah. And you had mentioned, Ken, sometimes people will freeze their stuff to hold it before adding it to the pile. That is a really good technique to kind of reduce the mass or the size of material. Shredding it also does the same. And what both of those techniques do is it, freezing, you can kind of break those cell walls, makes it easier for microbes to get in there and decompose stuff. Shredding things gives you more surface area, allows those microbes to get in there, decompose them quickly. So again, kind of thinking like you can do this if you have, 50 acres, but also if you have like a really small area where you're composting, freeze it, shred it, reduce that particle size, and not only will it reduce the pile size, it will also potentially compost faster.
Yeah, as I say, especially if you're using leaves, something that if you've got access to a chipper shredder or just run over them with a lawnmower first, reduce that size, increase that surface area. That'll help quite a bit, which is probably why one of the reasons why ours doesn't compost very fast, because gets thrown on as is. It's not as little effort as possible.
I tell myself and my wife that the only thing holding me back from being an active composter is getting a gas-powered chipper shredder, something that could handle like a 10-inch wide log or something, because I want to go cut whole trees down and do this. 10 inches would be excessive. Like I think most go 3 inches of diameter branches, or
I think that's what they say.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get bigger than that. It doesn't like it, but
read your manual. Don't listen to me. Oh yeah. So still in the market for the good chipper shredder that we talked about in years past.
I'll write you a note if you need.
Thank you.
So I think our next, point, our questions we get sometimes is, can you compost in the winter? So, there's charts out there. I don't know if there's any that we could pop in here or not, but you kind of look at the peak activity or the activity during a compost. But a lot of times that peak's really going up in the summer as it's getting warmer. Everything's active and going, and as it starts cooling off, your activity starts going down. And when we get into the winter, when it starts getting real cold, your activity of your bacteria, your microbes and stuff really kind of tails off. But if it's not too terribly cold, there's still going to be some composting going on outdoors. So it can go on in the winter, but the activity and kind of the amount of composting going on is going to be much, much lower than during kind of the active growing season. So that's why in our house in the past, we've done the vermicomposting. And even then, your worms can eat up to kind of their body weight in food. So if you have a pound of worms, it's a pound of kitchen scraps. So even then, unless you've got multiple bins, you're still probably have more kitchen scraps than you're going to be able to compost. So you could freeze them then if you wanted to.
Right. Yeah, we're the same boat with the vermicomposting. Maybe that will be the future show that we can talk about. But I noticed with the worm bin that as long as even when the worm bin wasn't as active, as long as I took our kitchen scraps and I threw them in there and I covered them up with something, some of the compost or shredded paper, whatever we had in there, we never had issues with like odor, never had issues with flies, anything like that. And so if you're really serious about maybe diverting waste from the landfill with your kitchen scraps, you could potentially get depending on how much storage you have in your house, get 5-gallon buckets or whatever and put soil or sawdust, potting mix, something where then, you have that bucket and then you put your kitchen scraps in there and then you cover that up to reduce the odor. I think sometimes people add things like lime to halt or kind of reduce odors as well. If you're really serious about holding your greens in the wintertime, so you can put them out in the springtime to then compost that year. So that is an option. Depending on how much you cook at home, you might need lots of space to store 5-gallon buckets or whatever size tote you use.
And I guess another thing I've seen, I don't say a lot, but becoming a little more prominent, I guess, is the, I guess, countertop composters. So you put your stuff in there and then, I don't know, they heats it up and it turns it, and in 24 hours you have compost. Supposedly, I don't think that's really would be considered compost. You've kind of cooked it, started the process of breaking it down. I've never tried, but I wouldn't be surprised if, you put some seeds in there, try to grow it. They probably would struggle. And that's way too fast to get kind of fully kind of stable compost. So that may be something, you could do something like that, store that, and then use that in your compost bin or your worm bin. But I wouldn't use that as straight up compost. Those tabletop or countertop ones, they've got, different, well, they run for 24 hours or 8 hours, or just kind of depending on the mode. And usually you put a tablet in there. I'm assuming that's got microbes or something in there to speed up the process and stuff. But I've never looked at the finished stuff. But I can't imagine that would be what you would consider compost stable. It's too quick.
That, I think they call it bokashi, or is that what it is? Like that style of countertop composting. I've never done it myself either, but I've heard it described less decomposition, more fermentation. Like and you got to be careful with fermentation. If that's what it is, maybe I'm totally off the mark here, because a lot of times we do that to preserve things and so decomposition doesn't take place. So yeah, I think it's something probably I need to study about more. Well, Ken, I guess, speaking of finished compost, knowing when compost is done, what exactly are we looking for when we want to go in and use this compost that we have created?
So when you think you're done, your compost, whatever you're pulling out of there, it's not going to smell, or it's going to smell like soil. It's not going to have any kind of off smells to it. It's going to have that kind of darker brown color to it, earthy aroma, and you're not going to be able to tell really what it was made out of. So you're not going to be like, oh, there's that carrot I put in there. That's going to be broken down. There's that, straw. You're not going to be able to tell it's made from straw or carrots or apples or whatever you put in there. So you can do that kind of visually. Another thing you can do is you can kind of test it. So you could containers, you put some with regular soil in there, a 50-50 soil compost mix, or what you're pulling out as compost, and then the compost by itself. Put some seeds in there, something like germinates quickly, something like radishes, and then see how that germinates. If it's really struggling in your compost, your 50-50 mix, it's probably an indication that it's not quite ready. Assuming it's not struggling in your regular soil too. Your regular soil is your check, more or less. And then if it's struggling and it's not germinating well, it's really yellow. That's probably an indication that that's not quite ready yet. You may need to turn or do something to that to let it break down, or a little more, or let it rest a little bit to kind of finish up that process. Once it's done cooking, or once it's not warm anymore, there's still going to be a process breaking that down. You're going to have different microbes moving in after it's done with that hot compost kind of period. That your actinomyces and the fungus and stuff will move in and kind of finish off that compost.
And I think the term finished compost maybe it doesn't represent the best way to say that, because it's not done yet. It might be done with that hot active composting, but Yeah, there's still a whole lot, probably chemically, that needs to go on to keep breaking that material down, as the fungi then move in and really work to break those bonds apart to make those nutrients then plant available. Yeah, I just thought about that. Yeah, finished compost. Now I don't know, should I say that anymore?
And we never
But
really talked much about actually what's it doing, the
yeah, we didn't.
composting. So yeah, we've mentioned microbes. So you've got, microbes that are, so usually when we're composting, when it's actively composting, actively in quotes there, it's at 90 to 140, 150 degrees. You've got the bacteria that do really well in there, and they're doing a lot of that composting. That's generating the heat, helping that heat up. And as you're turning that, that's introducing oxygen and stuff. So you're constantly do that. After a while, they've kind of done everything they can. It starts cooling off. And then you have different microbes moving in them, actinomyces, which are kind of a type of bacteria. The fungus start moving in because they can't handle those real hot temperatures. So as it cools off, they move in. You'll have insects and stuff in there. If you got a lot of flies and stuff, that may be an indication it's going aerobic and stuff. But it's normal to have insects, worms, mites, and stuff kind of on the outside where it's cooler. They're feeding on that stuff, breaking it down into smaller pieces, which is going to help those microbes and stuff. So unless you've got an excessive amount of flies, it's normal to have those other critters on there. But and as it's finishing up, you've got other stuff moving in. So you've primarily bacteria doing it, but you'll have fungus and small invertebrates and stuff. And as Dwayne Friend like to put, if you ever want to not have to turn, just throw some bones in there, and the raccoons will turn your compost for you.
Yeah. Oh man, that's one animal I try not to attract to my yard after having them live in my attic for years before we bought our house. It's a constant fight. I did visit someone who was an active composter, and they do these batches of compost where they gather coffee grounds from the local coffee shop, and then they have like wood chips, shredded leaves, a couple other kitchen scraps that they'll throw into their compost pile. And it's in these circular bins. And I did think and say to them that, man, it must not be easy to turn these. He brandished this weapon looking thing, this giant metal arrow, that he like shoved into the pile, and the arrowhead collapsed on itself, and then he could shove it in. And when he pulled it up, it flings, or there's spring loads, or those arrow sides flare back out. And as you pull it up, it just aerates that entire pile. So I'm like, wow, well, that is a great tool for that job. And so you don't have to actually get a pitchfork in there and turn this compost pile over. And he's an active composter, looking to start a business selling it. So there's all kinds of gizmos and gadgets too out there to help you.
Yeah, and we mentioned the temperature compost thermometers and stuff. So that's one tool you can use, kind of monitor the heat of the pile. Usually put that in down towards the base, into the middle, and that's going to give you, so if you can kind of track to see, if you've got some of that active compost going on, if it's starting to cool off, that may be an indication it's time to turn and stuff. And those are going to be a little pricier than your normal kitchen thermometer that you're using. Mm-hmm. Another thing I've heard people using and heard people talk about is just using like a piece of rebar, sticking it in there, leave it in there for a day, come back later. This is going to work better if you're in the shade than in full sun. But then kind of feel that. And if it's pretty warm, assuming the sun's not heating it up, that's an indication that you're actively composting. But if it's cool to the touch, the indication that the pile may be slowing down. So maybe time to turn. So that's more you're active. If you're just doing a passive, you're not worrying about temperature necessarily. You maybe turn it every once in a while, but if you're actively doing it, you may be turning once a week, every other week, something like that. Whereas commercially, I think they, especially when they first start, they may be doing turning every other day. So, but they've got giant piles, windrows, and stuff. So it's a little bit different there.
Oh yeah, the commercial composting world is a whole different beast. So that is when you do put the whole chicken in there, and then it's gone after a week. So, well, the other thing, Ken, I think, yeah, we said like when if you're an active composter, and I suppose if you're the passive composter, you've just listened to us, and you probably just tuned us out this whole time thinking, man, that's a lot of work. Meanwhile, for the active composter, when that pile stops heating up, even when you're turning it, even when you're managing air and water, and it's not heating up anymore, that means that bacteria that's really been firing up no longer has enough food for it to go, and so that's when that fungi begin to colonize it, begin to break it down even more. But that's sort of that, dare I say, finished compost. And then when you would take that and you would spread that compost, and as you spread that compost, then the soil microbes start acting on it and break it down even more. And so when is compost actually finished? What a mystery. Now we have to actually get a real person on here who knows what they're talking about, some scientist or something. But yeah, so you would, in terms of applying compost, again, that person I had visited who was doing that batch composting, he had experimented with all these devices for sifting out material that maybe didn't make it on that first pass of composting. So there's a lot of different types of sifting equipment that you can use. One was he rolled it. You can roll it on the ground. You fill this cylindrical mesh cage with your compost, and you roll it, and the small stuff falls out, the big stuff stays in. You could do something simple as a hardware cloth on a 2x4 frame and just sort of pass it through whatever size mesh that cloth is. And then there's even these vibrating tables, and this is more commercial, but you would load it on a conveyor belt, and the table would vibrate and it would separate the particle sizes and weights. And then he would take anything that didn't quite get all the way composted down and throw that back into another compost bin to go another round. And that was then left behind with a more fine textured material, more a smaller material in terms of the particle size that could go in a spreader that you could just take and fling out on the ground. But I would say, there's different ways to use your compost in terms of how you apply them in your landscape. For the most part, I think we're going to be just top dressing. If you do have a vegetable garden and you want to work it into the soil, you could do that. But if we're working it into the soil, that is, again, another reason why we want to make sure that it has at least gone through that initial composting, that it's a finished compost, so that it doesn't tie up all those nutrients as it continues decomposing in the soil. But I think you could do that in the vegetable garden. You can top dress it, or you can till it in. For the most part, I think our landscape beds, flower beds, perennials, you don't want to dig that stuff in because you don't want to dig in the root system. So it's usually just top dressing on our landscape beds or on our lawns. If you do this on a lawn, you want to make sure you take a rake or something that you don't mat down the grass blades, and that you sort of get it down to the soil line, to the soil level. And it's not piled up high against the grass blades. I don't know how common this is, but I have heard where folks have put compost on their lawn, and it was, maybe too tall. They didn't sift it down towards the soil, and the sun came out, and because compost is dark, it got really warm, and it kind of baked the grass blades there. So I've only heard that happen on one occasion. I don't know how common that is, but something to be mindful of. But then what I use my compost for mostly is for my containers. I just mix it into the potting soil. And so that's what I primarily do when I throw compost into the mix.
Put it in your raised beds.
Yes. Call back to last week's show.
And another thing while I'm thinking of it, this is going to be a nightmare. It's probably going to have to cut this in somewhere else. But the moisture levels.
Oh, yeah.
So you need to keep it moist. I never actually said. So.
How moist, Ken? How? Tell us. What's the consistency?
So usually, yeah, for your pile, it's kind of think of like a wrung out sponge, kind of damp. If you were to take a handful of it, squeeze it, there shouldn't be any liquid coming out of it. If it is, it's too wet. So, kind of that wrung out sponge is kind of where you're shooting for that moisture level.
Put that in somewhere, or just leave it here because this has been a wandering episode.
Stream of conscious.
Yes, it has. There is another application method that we'll mention, but I don't think we're going to necessarily dive into it because, I just don't want to deal with it. Compost tea. There is definitely research that is ongoing about the use of compost tea. Just doing some of the reading on it. There's two types. There's aerated compost tea, and there's like non-aerated or steeped compost tea. Aerated is where you get like an air pump, air stone. You put compost in like some kind of a mesh bag, like a sock. You add other ingredients. The most popular one I've seen was molasses. And you aerate that for a certain amount of time to activate the microbes in that and to create a liquid leachate or a liquid feed for plant material. The other type of compost tea is you cut out the air stone and all the extra ingredients. You literally are just steeping like a mesh bag of compost in a bucket of water. And so those are the kind of the two types that I saw out there. There's research on these, and what it primarily says is that compost tea has typically no effect on whatever research project they're looking at. If we think of this whole compost tea research on like a teeter-totter, I call them teeter-totters. What's the other word for them? Not balance beam. Seesaw. Yeah, I like seesaw better. If you think about all this on a seesaw, no effect is kind of in the middle, doesn't really tip the scales either way. Positive effect on one side of plants, negative effect. It's really just the scales are not really like tipping any which way. It's really a lot of the research is saying no effect, no effect, no effect. There are some studies where they say, oh, this does seem to reduce maybe disease pressures, like disease presence on some of these greenhouse studies that they've done. I know I saw one where they used compost tea spray on greenhouse tomatoes, and they saw a reduction in bacterial leaf spot. I think it was some type of leaf spot disease on tomato plants. They saw a reduction in that with the compost tea treatment. Also, maybe sometimes like a soil irrigation using compost tea. But they also saw way more no effects and, a handful of negatives. So I think what we could maybe say about that is if you put something in water and you regularly irrigate your plants, it's probably good for them, and you will initiate some type of effect, positive or negative or nothing. And eventually you will measure something. If you just keep doing the study over and over again, eventually, you'll measure something. But if we look at the broad spectrum of studies, it is no effect.
All right. His email's down below.
Yeah, send me emails. Oh boy.
So I think one thing when people are using compost, a lot of times they kind of equate it to fertilizer, and that's not necessarily the case. So compost is going to have some nutrients, but it's a really low analysis. I think heard a lot of times like 222, 555, something like that. So it's not a very there's going to be nutrients in it, but it's not going to be the same as putting like a synthetic fertilizer down there. Even some of the organic sources are going to be a little higher analysis than compost. So it can provide some. It is going to provide some nutrients, but it's not going to be if you're really deficient in something, compost may not be the whole solution. to that. It can help, but it may not. You may have to add some other stuff to that as well. But and you mentioned, putting it on there, the microbes in the soil will feed on. So you're kind of, that's going to help feed that soil microbiome, which is going to be a healthy microbiome in the soil, is going to be good for your plants. So it may not be, providing a lot of nutrients directly to the plants, but those microbes, as they break it down, will release stuff, and you're feeding that. So it's still good. So you're going to have that benefit as opposed to like your synthetics, where you're just, putting that on there. You're not building the soil, but you're getting that boost of nutrition.
And I don't think I would be out of line saying that most gardeners do not do soil tests. Like, we do not know the nutrient rates of our soils, whether we have too much, too little, just right. But that is a suggestion that you'll hear coming from us a lot. And especially when we had our conversation with Zach Grant about contaminated soils, because Zach Grant, he's a Cook County extension educator, and he does a lot of work with like urban farming. They use a lot of compost in those systems. And he started looking at some of this research happening, showing a lot of pollution coming off of these gardens with all of this excess compost being used. And I think this is just another point, maybe as we wrap things up, to remind folks soil tests can be helpful, to know that if you even need to add some of these nutrient components, phosphorus being the main one that I'm thinking about, because phosphorus tends to be the one that builds up in our soils as it binds the soil particles. It doesn't move as readily unless there's like erosion happening. So phosphorus can build up to sometimes like toxic or unhealthy levels for plants. And some of our composts, like manures, can have high levels of phosphorus in it. And depending on what ingredients you would put in your compost pile. So you can get your compost tested. You can get it analyzed by a soil lab. You can send in a sample and they'll tell you what the nutrient analysis is. I mean, it doesn't cost a terrible amount, $15 for the test, usually $15, $20 for the test. We're maybe looking at another $10 in shipping. And so it is valuable to know, so that you're not putting something into your soil or on your soil that might be contributing to a pollution problem. Because while I don't think Ken and we're not responsible for the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, but get 10,000 of us, and yeah, we're contributors, and visual like yeah. So soil testing can be useful and important. You can analyze your compost if you want.
Yes, I would say, I would say definitely do that. But and I'd say for your average backyard composter, you're probably not creating enough compost where if you're adding it to your soils, you're probably not going to get to the, like they're seeing in some places in Cook County where they're constantly adding large amounts of it.
Yeah,
if you're just getting
inches.
Yeah, if you're just getting the load once a year, a couple times a year, sprinkle, half an inch on your soil, I wouldn't be too concerned. But there is that potential if you're adding a lot.
Yeah. I think Zach was seeing like entire just beds being just formed of compost. That's 5 to 10 inches worth of compost. And remember, everything in moderation in life, and that applies to gardening. So too much of a good thing starts to be a bad thing.
Except plants. You can never have too many plants.
I know. That has been a problem. So if only plants were cheaper, I could have more.
And more space.
More space. Start growing on top of the house. Well, that was a lot of great information about composting, how you can get started in your own backyard using compost, and hopefully doing a little bit of a soil test too, making sure we're being responsible stewards of our nutrients that we're adding to our gardens and landscapes. Well, the Good Growing Podcast was a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by me, Chris Enroth. Hey, Ken, thanks for hanging out. And as both both of us confess our passive composting habit. So thanks. I'm glad we're kindred spirits in composting.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'll go out and turn it for the first time this weekend.
Oh, it's so hot though, Ken. That's a lot of work.
I don't know. I think this weekend's supposed to be cooler.
Okay.
Maybe.
All right. Maybe I'll. All right. All right. I will turn it, and then again probe my wife, see if she'll like buy me that chipper shredder yet.
All right. Let me know if you need a note.
All right. I will.
And let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. It's the Farm Progress Show, so it's going to be a garden by week for us. So look for, and if we see you at the Farm Progress Show, hey, stop by and say hi at the extension tent. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you watch us on YouTube, watching, and as always, keep on growing. Well, I guess we'll go do this thing called a podcast. Ready, Ken?
Ready.